Hello, I am Becky Martyr, and I am a student at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College of Education. I'm getting my master's degree in reading education and ELL. I'm sitting here with Chris De Silva, the Director of Learning, Diversity, and Urban Studies, and a professor of the practice of education in the Department of Teaching and Learning. Professor De Silva holds a doctorate from the University of Nevada from the Department of Curriculum and Instruction with a program emphasis on teaching English as a second language and applied linguistics. Her research is focused on the learning ecologies of linguistically and culturally diverse students, family and community resources in diverse urban communities, and the partnerships between family, community, and school to support literacy learning and promote equity. Professor De Silva has taught in schools in Brazil and the U.S. and has worked with researchers in Chile, Brazil, and Mexico. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
This semester, I'm enrolled in a course centered around literacy development. Last week, we learned about James Paul Guy's sociocultural perspective on early literacy development. In Guy's introduction of the topic, he says, people adopt different ways with printed words within different sociocultural practices for different purposes and functions. Humans are always meaning producers, not just meaning consumers. What do you make of this quote?
Well, it's a lot there. But, the main premise of sociocultural perspectives is that learning happens in the social realm. Then it becomes internalized and goes back into the social realm as a transformed kind of either information or transformed practice, or however it is, that which you learned is transformed, and then back into the social realm. Yeah. So from that premise alone, the focus of learning is also development. And in that, you are always producing something new, not just the sum of its parts, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not just accruing knowledge, but you're producing new knowledge. You're transforming and producing new knowledge alongside others in the materials that you interact with through some social cultural tools such as language, for example, in the social context. So fundamentally, that makes this premise of humans being producers of knowledge very coherent with this social cultural perspective. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. So Guy proposes that we have a core grammar that's part of our biology, but oral language is developed socially. So we develop language customized to and for the specific context in which it's being used. And I know that you work a lot with students who are learning English as a second language. So how do you think this applies to young learners of English who have a different native language?
That's also a good question. The first part of the question having to do with humans having a core grammar, so to speak. So that refers to, the ability to have language, the ability to think through and in and with, and to communicate through and in and with language. That differentiates us from other animals. That alone does not produce language. Having the ability to do something doesn't mean that you actually do it, right? I think that's what he's getting at in thinking about, again, oral language being produced in a social context with others. And so necessarily you're going to learn the language of that context that you are immersed in.
Right.
And what you learn is, again, fundamentally a result of the conversations you're a part of, right? So for those who are learning English as another language, in the context of the U.S., then, they are picking up. It's not just an acquisition process, because they already have a language base in place that they are also continuously developing. But it is a process it's a more conscious process. It's a process of learning that new language. And so being in a context where that language is spoken, and also, different communities have their own ways of interacting with language, right?
Right.
And so that's why we call it Big D discourse communities, right? So depending on which communities these students are part of, they are developing, hopefully, both their native language and the new languages that they are engaged with in the new context of action.
Yeah, it's fun having so many ESL students in my classes, because they can share experiences of when they, like, pragmatic things where they've kind of gotten something a little bit wrong in the wrong context as they were learning English, and some kind of funny stories come out of that. Or
I know, even in our class, I don't know if you want to include this, but one of our peers was talking about learning English from Trump's.
Oh, really? Oh boy, what a language model.
It's a little scary, to be frank.
That's funny. Yeah, it's funny when I was in Thailand, just kind of hearing the different language that people pick up on, because they learn a lot of their language from media. Right. So like the different sayings and things they pick up on. I was like, why do you sound like a Southerner right now? Or why do you sound like a New Yorker when you say that word? It's funny.
It is so interesting. Yeah, and it takes a long time to develop your own, language that feels right for your own voice.
Right.
It takes a long time.
Yeah. I'm sure you know that too, as a speaker of multiple languages. Well, that actually leads nicely into my last question. Guy states that skill-based learning is not some general thing, but a different thing with different effects, as it is differently situated inside different specific social practices and discourses. How do we help immigrant students understand the different social practices and capital D discourses in our schools? What modifications or stepping stones can we use with immigrant students to help them be successful within our cultural models? It's a lot there. Sorry.
A lot there. Yeah, good questions. So I would beg to differ a little bit on this one, in the sense that, I think it's important for us to position ourselves, us as educators, to position ourselves as learners of students, learners of communities, learners of discourses, and really develop a kind of an ethnographic eye, if you will, to, try to understand the practices of their communities, try to understand how, what are their cultural ways of being, as particular to their households, for example. Understand that communities have histories. Yeah, understand that these histories entail sets of practices, rituals, and whatnot. And from there, from that, understanding that is not just at a surface level, but a more engaged kind of understanding of learners and the ways they learn, the different epistemologies that their communities come from, the different histories of their communities, and so forth. From that kind of layered and more in-depth recognition of where they're coming from, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Then you can begin to think about how do we leverage that into our school grounds,
Mm-hmm.
But not just skill-based, right?
Mm-hmm.
But more deeply into how can I really bring this history onto the practices of school
Mm-hmm.
in a really legitimate way,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Without just paying lip service and so I think really establishing relationships with students, families, and communities
Mm-hmm.
outside of the walls of the classroom is one way that you can begin to accommodate, or I don't even like that word very much, but
Mm-hmm.
that you begin to create new practices, produce,
Right.
like we talked about already. How do we produce this knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
or co-produce it with the students in ways that are meaningful to all that kind of way?
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about how we develop language in a social way and how that happens as infants, but then also if you're learning a second language, you have to learn all the social things around that as well. And we talk a little bit about leveraging the strengths that these immigrant or ELL students bring into our classrooms. So I think we talk about it a lot in our class, and it's definitely something that I want to focus on as an educator as well, is how to properly do that in my classroom, making sure that every student's voices are heard. I think that's going to be something that I continue to research and continue to read about as I move forth in my career.
That will make me so happy. I think, and maybe we are done, but what that will help you do is to really be mindful of the assumptions you make,
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully to really try to suspend these assumptions and
Mm-hmm.
have a more in-depth look and more observant, more perceptive
Mm-hmm.
look at, not only what are these children learning, but how are they learning and why.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. That was a wonderful conversation. See you next time.
Thank you so much.